Well, a very good evening to. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to Campion this evening for the Hilary Term Campion Lecture. And also my pleasure, of course, to introduce Professor Jane Stevenson. Jane is a senior research fellow here at Campion member of the English faculty. Her work ranges very widely from Latin and classical tradition to women's intellectual history, exile and recusant culture, and the circulation of British autism. She's equally at home in the afterlife of pets and of cities, as in her very popular book on Siena. This evening's lecture, 1758, The Secret History of a Papal Election, is occasioned by the identification of a remarkable book owned by the Jesuits in Britain, here in the Rare Books collection at Campion Hall. It's a book, but it is surprising even exists. That have it, a record of votes of cardinals in this very important tense conclave, to put it the statement when the Society of Jesus future will stay and will credit from the monarchies of Europe. To reconstruct the dynamics of this highly charged event using this remarkable source, demanding historical task. And Jane is uniquely well equipped to do that for us. So we're very grateful to you, Jane, for sharing research on this question. So please do join me in welcoming.
Very much. Well, as the Master said, Campion inherited their books from Heathrow College. Wilson Felstead came in to catalogue them and found that we had a complete set of tally sheets related to the election of Pope Clement XIII, which give you a sort of insider's view of what actually happened from day to day in the conclave. And there is something fascinating about a papal conclave. You have a group of powerful elderly men, all of whom have faith commitments already, who are locked up together, and one of them will emerge effectively as a completely different person. The tally sheets bring together the results of the individual votes, being held twice a day from May the 3rd to July the 6th. It tells you how it changes from day to day over this long conclave, 64 days. Now, I was trying to get the sense of the overall pattern of this. I just ignored everyone who got 1 or 2 votes. And for each of the twice daily sessions, I noted the men who got 3 or more. And this gives a view of the decision-making process behind the election, which in the event took everybody by surprise. That's a sort of papal conflict idea. It's an earlier conclave, in fact, 1667. But things had not fundamentally changed 100 years later. Basically, once they've been locked up together, twice a day, the end of the morning, the end of the evening, the cardinals set up the altar in the Sistine Chapel and drop their ballot into a chalice. 3 cardinals, appointed in rotation, tally the votes for each scrutiny to produce a complete record. One of the 3 is in charge of the tally sheet, a printed paper with all the names of the cardinals on it. Dozens of these sheets must have been printed in the 9 days between Benedict's death and the beginning of the conclave. So the tally man fills in the date, the AM or PM, and as each vote's read out, he puts a mark beside the name of the cardinal that has been voted for. So you can see these tallies just to the right there. The 3rd man counted the votes and threaded them together in a bundle. If the numbers of votes, the numbers of cardinals didn't correspond, the lot was burned and there was another ballot. The actual votes were burned. They're what's made black or white smoke, but the tally sheets are retained. They would have an obvious usefulness for any cardinal who writes the conclave and they might also be of use to its external parties. Now, the actual process of voting was formalized in 1622 by Gregory XV. Each cardinal receives a printed ballot slip for each scrutiny and marks it with a unique motto and number known only to him. This very ingenious printed voting paper was used. He writes his own name at the top, he writes his choice in the middle, and he writes his motto at the bottom, and then it's folded over twice. So only the middle compartment with the name can be seen by the scrutineers. So that's what it looks like when it's folded up. The back of the voting papers covered with fancy printing to stop any writing showing through. You may have noticed with a picture of the book that you've also got a left-hand column with an occasional mark in it. That's for second choice. The accessorials, and it was completely optional. But obviously, if somebody got quite a lot of second choice, it would sort of show you how the wind was blowing. So what the tally sheets tell you is how many votes a cardinal received, but it does not tell you who voted for them. That's secret. The sheets also record when the cardinals joined, or in one case, the conclave, because the number of votes has to be cast matched to the exact number of cardinals present. Normally, these votes are anonymous, except in the case of the final tally. As proof of valid election, that set of votes unfolded, and the identity of the voter in the last round is noted. So it's a pretty bomb-proof process. Clearly, they took it extremely seriously and had, over the centuries, worked very, very hard to produce something which is anonymous. Now, the tallies, as I said, the tally pages have a sort of interest or indeed importance as sort of reference items during the conclave. And clearly, some princes attached great importance to information about how the cardinals had voted. So from time to time, somebody managed to abstract them on behalf of the patron. Now, ours is not the only example in the British Isles, rather surprisingly. There's another copy, another set, that's George's Chapel, Windsor, which relates to the election of Innocent XIII in 1796. Brought back from Italy by a canon of Windsor who'd been on grand tour, about 70 years after the documents, so it must have been bought purely antiquarian item. Our volume, similarly, must have been a particularly contemporary. The Society of Jesus, of course, were counting their friends and enemies at this juncture. But our book, like the one at Windsor, has an antiquarian because it has the bookplate of Hartwell de la Garde Grisel, the founder of the Oxford Union Society. This is Grisel as a young man. He became patron in 1869, which meant he had the duty of attending on the Pope during the state. He amassed a vast collection of relics and what you might call sacred curios during his 35 years in Rome, much of which he brought back to Oxford. He died in Rome in 1907. But when he wasn't serving at the papal court, he lived at 16 High Street here in Oxford, where he set up a private oratory which was frequented by many early convert members of Oxford University. This, of course, is it. As you can see, he had an unbounded enthusiasm for relics of every description. He left the relic collection in trust to the Catholic Archdiocese of Birmingham, with the proviso that it should be housed in a chapel within the oratory of Oxford. But it's also clear he was enthusiastic in acquiring memorabilia, and given his passion for ceremonial, the book of tally sheets is exactly the kind of thing he'd have liked. Now, there is nothing on the book itself to say, but at a guess, when Campion Hall was founded, he gave the book to Richard Clarke, his contemporary, the first master of Campion, died in 1900, because of its relevance to the suppression of the Jesuits. Well, no, that's all we know about provenance. I want to turn to the actual election. Back in 1758, Benedict XVI was going to be a very hard act to follow. He was civil, efficient, highly intelligent. He was one of the most diplomatic of popes, a man who Horace Walpole, who wasn't keen on Catholics, said, a man whom neither wit nor power could speak. But life was getting fairly difficult for the popes in the middle of the 18th century. You have secular rulers setting their hearts on the church, Catholic monarchs sponsoring theologies which minimized papal authority and expanded the rights of the national churches. So the choice of pope was of considerable importance. Outside Rome itself, the people with most influence on the outcome are the French king, the Holy Roman Emperor, or in this case, Empress, because both had the right to veto one candidate, as did the King of Spain. The relevant French king is Louis XV, who had been on the throne for 43 years and was related to the rulers of Spain and Naples. Perhaps Habsburg monarch Maria Theresa had been ruling for 18 years and was married to the Grand Duke of Tuscany. So very experienced politicians, both of them. In terms of politics rather than culture, the mid-18th century is the age of the Enlightenment, deeply alarming to conservatives. Voltaire was arguing for religious toleration and freedom of thought. He campaigned to eradicate priestly and monarchical authority. He supported constitutional monarchy, ideas equally unwelcome to the French, the Habsburgs, and the British. His contemporary Denis Diderot founded the in 1751, and its secular, skeptical attitude to restriction angered both religious and government authorities. During the pontificate of Benedict XIV, which had just come to an end, there had been a significant papal engagement and indeed patronage of new learning. But one of the factors governing the choice of new pontiff is whether or not that would be continued. Another issue of the time, of course, was the Society of Jesus, regarded with increasing detestation for as a transnational institution, its activity militated against the interests of the absolutist state. And on April the 1st, 1758, unintentionally took the first step towards their suppression. He wrote to Cardinal da Gama, authorizing him to act as visitor of the Jesuits in Portugal and the Algarve and the Indies. Now, Saldana was in the pocket of the Prime Minister of Portugal, who was the Jesuits' arch enemy, the Marquis of Pombal. He promptly exceeded the purely investigative authority granted and issued an edict declaring all Portuguese Jesuits were guilty of engaging in trade in violation of canon law. A few days later, the Patriarch of Lisbon suspended all Jesuits from pastoral ministry. So clearly, their enemies are taking any to bring down the society. And something which may be relevant to the election, according to the Jesuit historian Giulio Cordara, faced with these dangers, 18 cardinals, at the instigation of Cardinal Albani, swore an oath not to elect a pope hostile to the Jesuits. Now, the Jesuits themselves had internal issues. Their very able General Luigi Gentile died in October of 1757, leaving the society leaderless. It was not till May the 21st, 1758, in the middle of a conclave, that his successor was elected. He was Lorenzo Ricci, he was Florentine, his brother was regent of the Grand Duchy of Tuscany on behalf of his nominal duke, who was Maria Theresa's husband, Francis. In the opinion of a friend, he was not the right man for troubled times on account of his placid nature, too even I regarded him as little suited for a time when disturbance and storms seem to require extraordinary application of unusual remedies to unusual evils. So thinker outside the box, and the box had got a bit strange at the junction. Anyway, so as the cardinals try and make up their mind, the two biggest issues that they are facing is what they intend to do about the Enlightenment and what they intend to do about the Jesuits. Now, immediately after his death, the former pope is the centre of attention, but not for long. There are 9 days of ceremonial dedicated to his lying in state, his funeral, but on day 10, the focus shifts to his successor. On the 10th day, the cardinals then in Rome are conducted to the Vatican in procession and locked in. Shutters are slapped up on all the external windows, and as far as possible, they are sealed off from the outside. Anything that comes in through a rotulus, like a nun's grill. Now, an 18th century conclave was a physical ordeal, particularly for frailer and older cardinals. In 1758, their average age is 63. 12 of them, 4 of them were dead within 6 months of the end of the conclave. Something. Now, the elections held in a small, well-protected section of the Vatican Palace sealed off. As soon as the Pope's death was announced, carpenters got busy creating a set of wooden cubicles, rather like garden sheds, in the Vatican staterooms. Each one was 13 by 11 feet, and they're assigned to the cardinal by lot to, obviously, to prevent from little sort of gangs. You can see how they're arrayed within the rooms. A couple in the small rooms, 4 in the larger rooms, and so on. Each cubicle also houses the cardinal's chaplain and servants sleep on the floor. This timber-framed, cloth-covered cubicle was assigned to the cardinal. While glamping it isn't, it must have been extremely uncomfortable. The Vatican's physical environment was far from pleasant. Behind these shuttered windows, this was summer in Rome. Air conditioning had not been heated. The cubicle was stuffy, airless, and stifling. Also, you're near the banks of the Tiber, so it's stagnant air might mosquitoes, infestations of other insects, fleas, lice, hard to control. But with at least one servant and a chaplain per cardinal, there were at least 18 men on day 1, and as the conclave filled up, more like 140. Not intended as living accommodation and sanitation. Waste disposal and hygiene were a perpetual problem. The gracious force of the Vatican must have got pretty squalid in the course of the summer. Alderano Cibo commented on the 16th in the winter, the torments of the conclave are not small. Cold, sleep, vigils, difficulties, and apprehension were all spent in this holy election, the conclave itself being cramped, and the stench becoming unbearable. That's in the middle of winter. What about the middle of summer? It must have been fetid. So, let's now think a bit about the cardinal. They were 55 in 1758, but that certainly didn't mean they had an equal chance. Quite a few are off before the conclaves even opened. Everyone knew French cardinals could expect to be vetoed by the House, and vice versa. That takes out 6. The 5 Portuguese and Spanish cardinals are also not started for the same reason. The known favourites of the great powers might be in trouble. Former French ambassador thought the French really wanted a very, very conservative Neapolitan cardinal, Giuseppe Spinelli, but feared he was unelectable. They were right. Orsini showed each cardinal in turn a letter in which the King of Naples told the electors to support him, using disgrace Naples because he tried to introduce the Inquisition. And what the tally book shows us that Choiseul's quite right. Never in my list of people who get more than 2 votes in a day. Next best, from the French point of view, Cardinals Cosimo Imperiali, who used to be Spinelli's cousin, and Giacomo Oddi, men of long choral experience. Have I, sorry, slightly in the wrong order here. Just a reminder that the Cardinals had an opportunity to elect the first because Henry Benedict, the younger son of James III, was amongst their number. In fact, he did not receive a single vote during the entire process. The delightful pastime of annoying the English was, I think, sort of past this occasion because there were so many more serious things to worry about. Now there's Spinelli and Tamburini and Imperial and Giacomo, all of whom were fans of French. As voting began, Maria Theresa was thought to favour the cardinal protector of the empire. The French would fancy Prospero Colonna because he's cardinal protector of France. Now, there were a fair few Colonna popes, but this one, not one of these cardinals gained any traction whatsoever. Another group who attract automatic suspicion of the Florentine cardinals because they're the subject of the Habsburg Grand Duke of Tuscany, Maria Theresa's husband. There were 7. Nobody ever votes for them. Obviously, if deemed too friendly with the Society of Jesus would have problems with Bourbons. So Cosimo Imperiali, despite the fact the French liked him, had Lorenzo Ricci, the new Jesuit general, as his defensor. Then there are Cardinals Clemente and Orsini, papal powerful. Their fellow cardinals might have hesitated to give them the job. Indeed, they didn't vote for them. Plus, there are at least 2 cardinals who are far too old or ill or refused to be considered. So what all this adds up to is that for one reason or another, there were nearly 30 cardinals out of the 55 who would have known from the start they were most unlikely to be elected. Therefore, they'd prefer to get behind a preferred candidate rather than try to gather support on their own behalf. There's another reason why the cardinals didn't start off on an equal footing. The sheer logistics of the process favours Italians above foreigners and above all, men with choral jobs. Those were the men who knew each other and were known to the envoys of the secular powers who took an interest. And if there is one maxim which seems to have been acceptable to all parties, it was better the devil you know than the devil you don't. So, sort of nobody's going to elect some bloody that's just not how it worked. There are also perceptible factions. One of the Zelanti, the conservatives, the defenders of the rights and privileges of the papacy, with Cardinal Spinelli at their head. Spinelli, of course, considered the late pontiff a dangerous liberal. Then there are the seniores, the cardinals appointed by the previous to Benedict XIV, headed by Cardinal Corsini. They're a powerful group because they've been around for so long, they're very well known. There are 11 of them, enough to be a voting bloc, not enough to candidate. There's something else that we need to remember. We're used to a world of aeroplanes, but getting to Rome in 1758 was no easy task. Conclave opens 10 days after the Pope's death with the people who are on the spot, which is why this one opened without enough cardinals to make an election. Those who were not based in Rome had to be informed. When the conclave opened, these couriers must still have been on the way to Paris, Vienna, and Madrid. So if a cardinal didn't decide to come, he had to get there. In an age when taking a coach and 6 over the Alps was the fastest way for an elderly gentleman to get himself into sleep. None of the Belgian or Spanish Portuguese made the slightest attempt to go to Rome, except for one, Cardinal von Rort, who came bearing the views of Empress Maria Theresa and took 2 months, and 2 Frenchmen who spent 3 and 4 weeks on the road respectively. The Bourbons were fortunate; they had a Spaniard on the spot, Cardinal Guerrero, because of Sabina and Spanish ambassador. All the other votes were Italian, except for Henry Benedict, who of course had been. One of the fascinating things to me of looking at the actual tallies is they show all the manoeuvring and advising and politicking by people like the Choiseul and the various ambassadors was totally futile. The front runner in the first vote was Cardinal Delci. I think this must have been a courtesy vote. He was 88. In fact, he died 2 years later, but he'd been a cardinal in 1737. He was dean of the Sacred College of Cardinals, a distinguished Vatican elder statesman, and he must have been well liked. Also, the cardinals could vote for him as a graceful gesture, in the happy certainty that he would be elected, while they mulled over other possibilities. Since 1179, the electoral vote needs a 2/3 majority of all cardinals. There were 55 cardinals, so the winner needed to get 30 votes. When the conclave opened, there were 27 of them. The required number wasn't reached till the 2nd of June. So the first fortnight of voting is undertaken in the certain knowledge that things happen. So another person who attracted votes on the first day is Marcello Crescenzi, the Bishop of Ferrara. We'll hear more about later. This is a little sort of straw in the wind that he is popular. On the second day, Delci's down to 2 votes. Morning sessions used the appearance of Carlo Cavalcini in the morning, 6, and Carlo Sacripanti in the afternoon, with 5. Crescenzi fades out at this point, but he'll be back. Delci's vote dwindles to a polite 2 or 3 by the end of the first week of June. But he continues, people go and voting for him. So he's obviously benefiting from being hugely familiar figure. As if some cardinals were just so uncertain of how to proceed, they favored a brief papacy as an interim solution. He stays on the leaderboard to the bitter end. The total absence of tactical voting actually is very striking. Up to the very last day, about half the cardinals frittered away their votes on candidates who hadn't the slightest chance of being elected. One person who does get some support in the early days is Carlo Maria Sacripante, Bishop of Frascati. He'd been a cardinal for 20 years, he was treasurer to the Sacred College, so they may have thought he had a head for figures. The French liked him, so did the Spaniards, and though this probably wasn't known in June, so did the Habsburgs. He continues to get 3 to 5 votes in each session till the end of the 3rd week of June and then disappears. I suspect they may have stopped voting for him quite simply because he was looking like death. His health was obviously breaking, if not broken. He actually died in November. The physical ordeal of the conclave had probably shortened his life. The same is true of Cardinal Arquinto, who died on the 30th of September, having also been the subject of a great deal of plotting behind the scenes. You had to take the stamina of your candidate into consideration. Actually, the first serious candidate was Carlo Cavalcini, a jurist and the prefect of the Sacred Congregation of Bishops. For the first 3 weeks of conclave, he gathered as many as 6 votes in each session. I just want to explain how these work. The blue stripe at the end is the 30 votes. For each of these persons, it's the number of votes you get. So morning, afternoon in each case. So you can see Cavalcini is significantly ahead of anybody else. You know, the nearest to him, Delci is getting 5, Crescenzi is getting 4, and Carlo Rezonico is getting on occasion 3. The second week of June, so he's getting 9 to 13 votes. And on the 18th, he gets 17. That is the most achieved by any candidate so far, giving a strong feeling the conclave might be gathering behind him. He's also started to pick up second choice votes, an indication, that there are people who might be willing to get behind him. You have to remember, it's the cardinals themselves who tally votes in rotation. So if one individual starts gathering support, the whole body is going to be very well aware of it. However, there is an external factor. I think that's Cavalcini there, sort of, with his 17 votes, but he's also got 4 second choice votes. So the Duc de Choiseul notes in a memo to the French king that he'd be bad for France. Cavalcini deserves to have his supporters. He's a prelate of great piety who has always behaved with dignity. But he is zealous for the bull Unigenitus, Jesuits, anti-nationalist. He has warmly supported the canonization of Bellarmine, a Jesuit. His feeling on ecclesiastical affairs is contagious. So we don't want him as Pope, French. And Maria Theresa also didn't like him, again, the Jesuits. So Cavalcini is pushed out of the race by the French king's veto on his candidature on the 21st of June. The 2 French cardinals had arrived on the 9th and the 19th, respectively, and on the evening of the 21st, Cardinal de Deuil, acting on instructions from the French government, presented the formal French veto to Delci, who was as a sacred college, causing a great deal of anger at this external interference. For the rest of the conclave, 1 or 2 people voted for Cavalcini in every session, presumably out of sheer blood or as a protest. They knew he was unelectable, but they voted anyway. And there's Horace Mann, who was a malicious character, thinking about how Cavalcini would have taken this. But notice that his voluntary crime in the eyes of France is being a declared friend of the Jesuits and having wrote strenuously for promoting the canonization of Cardinal Bellarmine. Man is well informed, and that's exactly what de Choiseul has against him. Now, in the first week of June, Cavalcini had been neck and neck with Marcello Crescenzi, a posh Roman who'd been nuncio in France and was Archbishop of Ferrara. But Crescenzi's support began to dwindle in week 2, and Cavalcini seemed winning. But the cardinals were aware the public was on his side. When Crescenzi entered the conclave on the 6th of June, he was accompanied by large crowds demanding his election. In the 3rd week, once Cavalcini has been neutralized by the French, he's still at the end of June, he's getting 6 votes, swapping first place with the ancient Delci every few days. His sojourn in France ensured that he was a candidate acceptable to the French. De Choiseul thought him neither good nor bad. Now, Carlo Rizzonico appears in the list with 4 votes a week into the conclave on 6th June. He's rather a dark horse as far as his electors are concerned, because he was an extremely conscientious bishop of Padua who lived in his see. So he wasn't well known in Rome. The French ambassador, Duc de Choiseul, wrote he knew very little about him. Though he says he has heard the man worthy of his state and fit for the papacy if he was Venetian, because the tension between the Venetian Republic and the papacy was of long standing. However, he did not recommend positively opposing him. Is all right from a purely French point of view, apparently. It's not exactly a ringing endorsement, but maybe in his view, Rezonico might be a pope the French could. Well, what might they have known about Carlo Rezonico in June 1758? He was from a very wealthy family, originally from Como. It brought itself into the Venetian patriarchy in his grandfather. He became cardinal in 1737, and in 1743, when he became bishop, he held a series of minor positions in the Curia, where he doesn't seem to have struck his contemporaries as remarkable. Benedict, however, that we have in Italy. He lives on his patrimonial assets, but he's rolling in money, and his ecclesiastical income is spent solely for the benefit of the poor and the church. Despite his frail constitution, he is tireless in his visitations. He'd undertaken one successful diplomatic mission, sorting out the problem of the patriarchate of Lydia, but otherwise he could have made almost no impression outside of his diocese. The one point casually made by Benedict may be more significant than it looks: the reference to his frail constitution. Only modern cardinals, as a voting body, repeatedly show a preference for Pope who is not Christian. Energetic and zealous popes were not necessarily good news for the College of Cardinals. An Italian agent for the Spanish crown once observed, "Old age and infirmity are the two great virtues in assigning who will be Pope. If it's not the oldest, it'll be the sickest." Anyway, the Habsburg envoy, Cardinal von Roth, finally arrived at the conclave on June 29th, about 6 weeks in, carrying a budget of instructions from Maria Theresa. Up to that point, according to the historians, Cardinal Albani, as Cardinal Protector of the Empire, had been working to keep together enough votes to provide a virtual veto if somebody unequal to the Habsburgs looked like being elected. Patterns of voting suggested this was to no actual effect. The Count of Riviera, who is the French minister to Sardinia and reporting at length, was under the impression the preferred imperial candidate was Cardinal Marquinto. In fact, Roth's instructions favoured Sacripante and Paolucci, and he was authorised to veto if a French cardinal looked like being elected. Sadly, Sacripante's candidacy had dwindled and died in early June. Marquinto never got more than 2 votes a session, and Paolucci got none. The only cardinal who succeeded in achieving a significant voting bloc was Cavalcini, who had been torpedoed by the French. However, things had changed. By June the 29th, there were 45 cardinals in the conclave. So, this is important. It was possible to assemble 30 votes without having to get everyone on the same side. It was clearly impossible. The first break in the deadlock comes in the first week of July, when a group of cardinals start voting for Cardinal Porto Ferrero, the Spanish ambassador. This suddenly appears as a significant contender. And you see how, very, very small numbers of votes. Nobody's getting anywhere near the sacred number of 30. Portocarrero, again, would not have been well known. He only became cardinal in 1756. His highly conservative colleagues might not have approved of his rather unusual speech. So it's possible to guess that the French and their allies are putting their energy behind him as a candidate sympathetic to the Bourbon interest, presumably a direct response to the arrival of von Roth as imperial. However, the fact that the French had exercised their royal veto probably did this candidate no good and made it hard for his cause to gain traction. Pastor's monumental history of the papacy states that at this juncture, the French and Corsini were working for Crescenzi, Portocarrero, for Paolucci. This was absolute tosh. It was Portocarrero who was accumulating votes. Nobody was paying any attention to French Paolucci whatsoever. But it just goes to show you that the reporting of what is happening in the Vatican is it's a powering lot of guesswork. Anyway, the alternative to Porto Carrera seems to be Crescenzi, of whom the French were suspicious, because every day of voting, either Crescenzi or Porto Carrera top of the leaderboard. So if Albani was doing anything effective to influence the vote, they must be backing Crescenzi, who was also benefiting from the approval, apparently, of Corsini, leader of the C. Now, von Rort made himself instantly disliked by his fellow cardinals as a bully. He seems to have been abrasive and decisive. He was also clear-minded. I would suggest that he contemplated his stiflingly hot the fetid unpleasantness of the Vatican after 6 weeks of Rome and summer, and determined to bring the conclave to an end as rapidly as possible. He may very well have consulted our very set. However he informed himself, it was perfectly clear. The election had been a state of deadlock for weeks, and there was nothing to prevent this going on indefinitely. This is not the longest papal election, I do assure. No. According to Petrocelli's diplomatic history of the conclaves, von Rort arrived armed with a list of 17 cardinals that would be acceptable to Vienna, of whom Porto Carrera was certainly not one, since he was identified with the French and Spanish interest. And from what happened next, Crescenzi can't have been on it either. Von Rort decided to take Spinelli into his office. He knows this because he wrote a letter about it to Maria Theresa after the event. The Neapolitan Spinelli, who the French had originally wanted, knew he was unelected. He looked at von Rot's list and put his finger on number 40, Carlo Rezzonica. Now, the number of cardinals voting for Rezzonica had bubbled between 6 and 2 each session since the second week of June, usually nearer 2. There were plenty of other cardinals regularly attracting a couple of votes. He was consistently just better than that, despite the handicap of being finished. He was not well known enough to have attracted significant numbers of voters, unlike Cavoccini and Delci, who spent their lives in the Curia, but he had a sort of tepid acceptability. Nobody seems to have had anything much against him. And even the Choiseul thought the conclave could do worse. However, Spinelli positively approved of him, because like Spinelli, he was conservative, did not share Pope Benedict's sympathy for Enlightenment thought. So de Rort and Spinelli went to work to get Rezzonica elected, which just goes to show sometimes it's so bad to be 14th on a list. They went about it with considerable skill. Spinelli sounded out the powerful, wealthy, and well-connected Cardinal Corsini, unofficial leader of the senior cardinals, who didn't turn him down, but said, could he think about it till July 4th? Petrocelli actually claims the price of his help with the cardinal for his grandnephew. Certainly, the red hat was duly awarded to the young man in 1759. Now, von Rort began negotiations with Albani because he was the cardinal protector of the empire, his natural fellow, and got him on side. Rort paid careful attention to Spinelli's advice because Spinelli was backed by the French at an earlier stage and therefore knew who the pro-French cardinals were. So von Rort avoided contact with Orsini, Porto Carrera, and cardinals, but he sounded out the Milanese Tuscans and found they were attracted by this proposal as a way of breaking the deadlock. Milanese and Tuscans together, there were 10 of them, a useful. Spinelli, meanwhile, managed to recruit Cardinals della Lancia, Doria, York, Lante, Torreggiani, and Arquinto, so that 19 votes for Rezzonica, more than 2/3 of 30 needed once you had von Rort and Spinelli's own votes. So it was beginning to look as if this might get somewhere. Corsini decided, after all, he would join the initiative and began recruiting cardinals who owed him favours. So all this is happening in the middle of the nights of 4th and 5th July, with people whispering in corners and cubicles, while the French cardinals and their allies are completely unaware of what's going on. They must have remained under the impression that either Portocarrero or Crescenzi was on the papal throne, because on every day of voting, one or other of them is top of the leaderboard. On the 5th of July, Rezzonico gets 4 votes in the morning, 4 in the afternoon, as usual. On the 6th, for the first time, he gets 8 in the morning vote, but with another 6 where he's the runner-up. After which, Von Roth, Spinelli, and Cosimo all went on their supporters simultaneously, because in the afternoon vote he got 31 and became. So, absolutely blindsiding the French and allies, and causing the click of dropping jaws all over the Vatican, and as the news got out, all over Rome. Horace Mann, again, is simply, I don't know what's happened. We've got a new pope. The cabals that have brought about this event are not yet known. But it's very strange the Holy See should interest itself to a mission. So it's the sort of thing that is apt to heal injuries. I'm sure it will work out all right. Now, the Republic had serious disputes to resolve with the Church over trade, borders, and the port of Ancona, but hey, Rezzonico, the ultimate outsider, was with the job. Now, if this bundle of tally papers went to the newly elected General Society of Jesus in the immediate aftermath of the conflict, I think he'd have read it with some satisfaction. If the French hadn't interfered, Crescenzi would have become Pope. Definitely pro-Jesuit. That's why the French vetoed him. The French, Spanish, and Portuguese enemies of the society had been almost completely unable to get the college behind anyone who favoured their interests. They had only the brief spike of interest in Portocarrero in the last week to show for their manoeuvring. Von Roth, the voice for the Habsburgs, made it clear the Habsburg priorities was avoiding the election of a pro-Bourbon and pro-French pope, that was Portocarrero, and if that meant electing one who was pro-Jesuit, he was Rezzonico, as Clement XIII, did his best for the Jesuits throughout the certificate, and the order was not suppressed until after his death. Now, one thing the tally book does show is that external pressure was frequently misapplied. Both the French cardinals and Van Rott turned up with instructions to press for candidates who'd already fallen by the wayside. And it also indicates that historians of the conclave are relying on gossip that could significantly misinform. But Varman on the imperial and royal veto, and the pastor history of the historian of the papacy says Cavaccini got 21 votes on the 19th of June, 26th, 21st, putting him far nearer the crucial 30 than Jack Sandage. Actually, he got 12 on both days. Giuseppe Novaes' history of the papacy says Cavaccini got 21 votes on the 19th, and Rezzonico got 22 on July the 4th. He got 3 in both sessions. So clearly, rumors of escaping the Vatican can be wrong. According to Horace Mann, who was obviously keeping his ear to the ground, Albani was pushing hard for the election of Cardinal Mosca before the French cardinals had a chance to get to Rome. But the attempt had failed. But this support was singularly ineffective. No votes were ever cast for Mosca. Also doesn't, it has to be nonsense. Before the first French cardinal arrived, the conclave wasn't even correct. The magic number 30 was only reached on the 29th of May. Even Ludwig Pastor can simply be wrong. He writes, the first candidature to candidature to arouse much attention was that of Quinto, which showed sign of finding support with the zelanity of some of the courts, but he encountered an insurmountable opposition from Corsini. Actually, only 2 votes were cast for him in the whole of May. Spinelli, who was supposed to be preferred by the seniors, did fracture. He once got 3 votes in the same period. On the 10th of June, Riviera reports the Sardinian king Quinto's meaning, but Sciarra Colonna with 16 votes puts him out. Actually, neither Quinto nor Colonna got any votes at all. So, the reaction of Horace Mann to the final vote, which I think worth quoting, is the conclusion is Cardinal Rezzonico was elected as a person almost indifferent to all parties. The French did not acquiesce, but they did not have support enough to interrupt the election. Now, the tally papers can only tell us who voted. Who was voted for. We can't attach names to the tally. But the last page of this book is signed witness to the complete of Van Rott, Spinelli, and Corsini's trial. Rezzonico himself acknowledged that Van Rott had boosted him onto the chair of St. Peter by main force because he thanks him. However, I think it's probably he who deserves the last word. My entreaties and protests failed to turn away this immeasurable burden from myself. You know my failings, if the others had known, they would never have done what it took to pass. I must hope it is the work of God. Sounds a bit like the Lord High Executioner. But, by a set of curious chances, he has ascended to receive St. Peter. So thank you.
Wow, Jane, that was wonderful. Far more thrilling than anything going on in the Winter Olympics at the moment. Thank you for that very informative, very entertaining, but quite serious point. The value of a primary text for questioning the public history, the Greek history, if you like, and really shedding light on the history. So, wonderful piece of work, and thank you, Eric, for such a wonderful narrative. Good. So we have some time to get with Jane. Those online are welcome to put questions in the chat box. So let me open it up to the floor. Who would like to?
What was the effect of the election across Europe? Did it have much impact politically or socially across France, and the UK?
The cry went up in the course of Europe. Who is this man? Everybody had assumed that the election would go to a known quantity, as an old Rome had, and it simply hadn't. So, the only immediate effect is that people start to find out about it. But he's also a compromise candidate, and they just watch him very cautiously for a while to see which way to jump. And he reveals his partiality for the Society of Jesus at quite an early stage. There's quite a lot of people.
How long did it take
10 years. Sort of modestly successful is how I'd put it. He did succeed in defending the society through against what were increasingly pressing attacks from their enemy. He was in frail health. He is not one of the dynamic and decisive popes, but he was clearly doing his best. He's remembered as a very charitable man. The poor blessed him, that sort of thing. But he wasn't remembered for sort of surprising diplomatic initiative. So he was perhaps a little, size too small for the job, but the of the Pope at that juncture was really, you do wonder. I mean, the pressure was so great.
That was wonderful and very informative and entertaining. But I must confess my ignorance. What did the cardinals do all day, apart from when they weren't voting? Do we know, or is that sort of so?
They were supposed to spend much of the day in meditation. They started off with mass, but they were supposed to pray privately before each actual vote for appropriate guidance. I suspect most of them probably did, but as things got tenser and tenser, they were obviously starting to sort of conversations in quiet corners of the Vatican.
There was no formal debate, or there was no formal debate.
Absolutely not. They're supposed to be making up their minds individually. Cardinal and God produce this vote. And they are not supposed to form parties, although clearly parties were in existence. You can't stop parties forming, and the seniors are bound to become a cabal. But in broadest theory, they're supposed to be individuals.
We have a question here.
Is there any evidence of the French reaction about being outmaneuvered?
I don't know of any. I didn't chase up what the French king had to say about it, but I'm sure he wasn't. And the Duc de Choiseul, who's the man on the spot, it says, well, we've got a pope. He's sort of all right, But I'm sure Louis XV would have been extreme.
I'm wondering about arrangements for meals. Would it be possible that trays were brought in, that messages were smuggled in from outside?
So obviously that happened to some extent. I mean, trays of food being brought in every day, and there were cardinals on special diets who demanded that they prepare their meals. And so I mean, you had some people in serious ill health, apart from what was extremely old. But efforts on. I mean, the gatekeeping is taken seriously. The sort of chamberlains are not conniving at smuggling, though. I seem to recollect roast chicken was banned because you could roll up something to get in the chicken. Yeah, only casseroles, only.
did this sort out relations between the Venetian Republic and the papacy?
They improved markedly. The Venetians were just so pleased to have a Venetian Pope because they didn't think that would ever happen. And of course, Rezzonico as Pope was sympathetic to the Venetian point of view. So the issues over Ancona didn't impact it.
Thank you, Jane. I enjoyed that enormously. So in Venice, I don't know of an archway dedicated to him. I don't know any music apart from books from his papacy. Was he a culturally fertile pope?
No. His most significant art intervention, I think, is ensured that the full statue in the Vatican was he seems to have had no interest in the arts.
10 points for that answer.
Can I just ask a question myself about this text?
This is a bibliographical freak because it's so unusual to have a printed book that's single. I mean, the whole point of print is duplication, but of course the pages are duplicated. So you know you have a book of 150 identical pages of the information by hand.
And how do you imagine that it got? I mean, was it meant to have been destroyed, or was it meant to have been kept locked up somewhere?
Well, I know of about 7 or 8 that have survived. The set in Ferrara, there's 4 sets in the Vatican. The Spaniards have a couple. I think at the end of the conclave, precisely because we don't sort of say who wrote it, just the tally marks. It's not very sensitive information. So if somebody, at the end of the conclave, it's waste paper. They can get treated like waste paper and burned, obviously, but if somebody says to Zavu, that's Brazil said, see the pattern of voting, there's nothing stopping anybody taking it out in their luggage. So clearly there are occasions when this is what happens.
It was interesting to note the British government representative, Sir Horace Mann. He was pretty well informed. Could you say anything about the British government's interest in a papal election at this time?
Well, what the British government, remember there's the 1745 rising is not really very long ago. The British government are enormously embarrassed by, the children of James III, who are still sort of alive and knocking over in Italy. The fact that, that Cardinal York was there, was voting, it might in theory be voted for, gave them happiness. Pitt, I think the reason why Pitt really wants to know what anything that man can find out about the election is because of the York factor. That they have this enormously embarrassing man on the spot. In fact, of course, the Cardinals had far more sense than to go anywhere. Because, they just complicated relationship with England for a political gain. What we've done, but prime ministers are nervous creatures when it comes to this kind. The fag end of the Jacobite, to mix a metaphor. It's a problem that's rolling around Italy. So, I mean, one of man's principal tasks in keeping on the other one, Bonnie Prince Charlie. The Jacobite cause isn't quite dead. It's moribund, but it's still enough to worry.
Good. Well, perhaps that's a good moment to bring our discussions. Many thanks, Jane, for a witty, incisive narrative about this conclave, and showing that this single text really altered the history of how we understand what's happened. You've really survived what a conflict at that time might have been. It's an attractive. But
they built a nice hostel now. It's so much less horrible.
The society needs to live another day. Have some fun. Ladies.
Thank you.
Many thanks. Others who are here present, so welcome to.